Hi learners, so welcome back, and today is lecture number 28 and we are in the thick of unit 4 now, and today I am going to talk about representations. Now when you hear the word representation, I know that it might conjure up meanings of how you see the term, and also try to understand how representations could be done in the media. Today, we are going to first talk about this work by Stuart Hall, a very influential theorist, particularly in spheres of media and culture studies, who talks about representation as cultural representations and signifying practices. Now, this is a work written in 1997, as you can see on your screen. Now, for Hall, the question of representation is actually one of the central practices which produce culture and a key moment in what would be called the circuit of culture. Now, you may wonder that why should we think about production of culture? Well, if you remember, in the first unit, I had outlined certain interconnections between culture, media and society, and how we think about culture actually has a great influence on how we think about the role of the media within it. Now, this circuit of culture is basically the cyclical loop within which cultural products and practices are formed, and primarily representation plays a big role, especially representation in media. So, what does representation have to do with culture, and what the connection between them is actually answered through this idea that culture is about shared meanings. Culture can only be understood by two people if they share certain codes of communication, because only then can they relate to each other, understand each other. And language is basically one of the privileged media through which we make sense of things, and meaning is produced and exchanged in that process. These meanings can be shared through a common access to language and culture. I have highlighted this point earlier also, that you can only understand people if you know what they are talking about, if there is a communication between the two. Language is central to meaning and culture and has always been regarded as a very significant kind of repository of values and meanings. This is also important to understanding the way that representations happen. So, when we think about language, how does it construct meanings? And if you will remember our discussion on the semiotic approach, you will go back to understanding some of these, that how does language sustain the dialogue between participants, which enables them basically to build a culture of shared meanings, understandings and interpreting them in roughly the same ways. So, it could be that you do not understand everything that I am saying, and it could be that I also do not understand everything that is being said to me by somebody else. But if I am able to process at least half of it, that is one way of understanding that communication is working. It is primarily through those shared meanings and codes. Now, if you start watching a video of this course in the middle of it, you may not be able to process the way that you will be able to if you are listening from the first one. And it is also because you are understanding the way that the instructor or the teacher has built up the course and making these interlinkages. So, what you see is also this idea of how you are able to make sense only if you are familiar with a particular kind of idea. So, language and culture are that, and language is able to do this because it basically operates as a representational system. And what is this representational system is that we use signs and symbols within language, whether sounds, written words, electronically produced images like emoticons today, musical notes, voice notes, objects, and they stand for or represent to other people our concepts, ideas and feelings. When we did that lecture on how meanings are created through emoticons in the Chinese context of WeChat and the Weibo platforms, there was this understanding that you will only understand what the image or the emoticon represents if you know the language as well as the shared context. So, primarily the question of representational basically also encompasses the use of these signs and symbols, which are basically mutually understood. Language is one of the media through which thoughts, ideas and feelings are represented in a culture. Representation through language is therefore central to the processes by which meaning is produced. Representation is very crucial because it is basically creating that meaning. And the circuit of culture, it suggests that in fact meanings are produced at several different sites and then they are circulated through the different processes of practices. So, how the meanings are created and curated and then carried over, they have a very different kind of significance and impact on representation. So, for instance, if I am creating a film and I want to choose actors and I choose actors who are not necessarily the dominant identities in the Indian context, I am trying to send a message and create a meaning that this film is not about the dominant identities, but about people who may not have been represented adequately. So, in this circuit of culture, I am already creating a different kind of practice and its process. So, what is meaning is basically that which gives us a sense of our own identity. We are able to make meaning when we are able to understand communication of who we are and with whom we belong. So, it is tied up with also questions of how culture is used to mark out and maintain identity within and difference between groups. Meaning is constantly being produced and exchanged in the personal and social interactions in which we take part, and in a sense this is the most privileged though often very neglected side of culture and meaning. Now, it is also produced in a variety of different media, especially these days in modern mass media, the means of global communication by complex technologies which circulate meanings between different cultures on a scale and with a speed which was unknown in history, primarily of the internet, where there is very fast and very urgent kind of meaning making. Meaning is also produced whenever we express ourselves in and make use of, consume or appropriate cultural things, which is when we incorporate them in different ways into our everyday rituals and practices of daily life, and in this way we give them value or significance. So, when basically we are weaving narrative stories and fantasies around the cultural products, we are also creating meanings. Now, meanings regulate and organize our conduct and practices. They help to set the rules, norms and conventions. So, if I am saying that there will be 5 questions from this particular portion in your assignment or your exam, you are immediately also alerted to thinking about how this means that this is important for exam purposes. So, the meanings, they basically regulate, they set the rules, norms and conventions by which we think how the social world is ordered, and they also basically govern and regulate the conduct of others who want to basically be a part of that social world. So, what we also see is the question of meaning arising in relation to different movements or practices in the cultural circuit that we are part of, how identities are constructed, differences are marked, and how production and consumption happens. However, in all of these instances and in these different institutional sites, one of the privileged media through which meaning is produced and circulated is language, and therefore, why language remains and continues to be very significant. The power of the language is that it is the tool of communication. Now, why Stuart Hall gives us this understanding of basically representation, and then goes on to talk about different facets of representation, meaning making, etc., is basically to make us understand how the media uses its nitty-gritties and inner workings to create the idea of meaning. Now, Hall and Chomsky and Herman have this connection between them, that they are focused on understanding the inner workings of the media. So, what you find is actually understanding how the media operates at an inner level. One is through the creation of the propaganda model, and the other is basically through this question of representation. How are stories created? How are identities represented? Now, one of the other works that Stuart Hall wrote was about policing the crisis, in which he looks at interconnections between mugging, the state, and the law and order. Now, the empirical starting point of this study is actually the mugging panic of 1972 to 73, during which mugging, a term previously reserved for the fearful extremes of US violence, many of you may have heard of mugging, basically suddenly swept the British media to identify a new strain of crime. So, this is the starting point of Hall's study, and what he observes is that what was new in this was not the crime in which robbing and or beating of a victim by petty professional operators or thieves who often work in packs work, but the labeling, and this labeling is the representation in media that we are interested in. This label imported full blown into British culture an image and a set of relationships, this is important, already condensed in the US law and order ideology, which is crime, black youth, fear of social disorder, and the conviction that society had become too permissive toward crime and criminals. The label of the crime, which is mugging, primarily what it does is it imports from the US to the UK an image and set of relationships built on these ideas: crime, black youth, fear of social disorder, and that society is too permissive towards criminals and crimes. Now, what happens is that not only was mugging not new, but such crimes were not especially on the increase in London, and this new label and the social reaction to mugging were out of proportion to the actual threat. So, mugging was symptomatic of a moral panic, and what this meant is that there was a panic created by the representations in the media. Stan Cohen had earlier come up with the concept of the folk devil and how these images convey a sense of moral panic. So, a condition, episode, person or group of persons, they emerge to become defined as a threat to social values and interests, and its nature is presented in a very stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. This is the stereotyping. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians and other right thinking people. You can see that the propaganda model that Chomsky and Herman talk about is in force here. These would be the sources, right, or the experts who would pontificate, give their opinion on mugging. Socially accredited experts who pronounce their diagnosis and solutions, and then ways of coping are also evolved or resorted to. Then the condition disappears once it becomes non-newsworthy, and what this does is basically primarily creates a sense of a moral panic where you see ideas of news and propaganda at work. So, Stuart Hall's study, although done earlier than the book that was written by Herman and Chomsky, basically illustrate how the media create an idea of a social disorder and represents the way that it wants identities to be. So, it is not a coincidence that the criminals are youths, particularly from black racial profiles, and then how they are associated with ideas of social unrest and disorder. Now, the historical moment of mugging is how the media manufactured mugging news, how the police identified and thereby manufactured black crime, and how the judges and experts drew upon the store of liberal and traditional ideology basically to create a justification for control. What you also see is that the media does not operate in isolation, right? It is actually operating in conjunction with the other social apparatus. What the agencies and the press were responding to was not a simple set of facts, but actually a new definition of the situation and a new construction of the social reality of crime. Mugging provoked an organized response because this was linked with a widespread belief about how the rate of crime in general was rising, and also a common perception that this was becoming more and more violent. So, the stereotypes, the perceptions, these are represented through these episodes. And what you see is basically the ideological construction of a reality where it is basically also related to certain facts. So, facts are used to create an ideological social reality. And in the case of mugging, the representation of generally the criminals from socially marginalized identities, what it ends up doing is reinforcing stereotypes that already exist in the society. This reaction to mugging was out of proportion to the level of the actual threat, as has been mentioned, and it could have been reconstructed through basically unreliable statistics. But what happens is when the media plays this kind of a role, it becomes more believable. There is more matter in the way that we think about a crime. So, you see a very conscious construction of also what would be a moral panic. Since it appeared to be a response not to the actual threat, it must have been a reaction by the control agencies and also the media to the perceived or symbolic threat to society, and that is what the mugging label represented. This made the social reaction to mugging more problematic than mugging itself, and Hall calls this the moral panic. So, he does not really say that mugging is not an issue or mugging is not a problem, but the way that it was framed, that creates a more moral panic. For instance, if we think about any kind of disorder, any kind of situation that we may be in, and the situation is already pre-existing, but if there are other ways in which your panic is exaggerated and exacerbated, that leads to increased additions. This is exactly what had happened in that context. This key role of the media cannot be treated in isolation. It can only be analyzed together with what other collective agencies in the mugging drama, and this is the central apparatus of social control in the state did, which is the police and the courts. So, this connects to the point that I was making earlier about the conjunction in which media operates with the social apparatus. Stuart Hall argues that the coverage of mugging in the media was not much about the actual events of mugging per se, but the court cases which succeeded such an event. So, these episodes of moral panic are not limited only to reportage of the muggings in the UK, but can be seen in different kinds of cases in the Indian context as well. What you see is basically the official reaction and the media reaction to the crime wave and the way that the crime itself is sensationalized. What is happening is a sensationalization of the crime. What you also see is basically the media playing a very interesting role in how it makes this into a newsworthy item. It creates and it curates a commodity. So, most crimes that are reported in the press at the time they occur are not subsequently followed through because the criminals are not always caught, but because the coverage of the trial is not newsworthy. This is very important that how crimes and their passage through the courts are routine and mundane, and therefore, when it is normal, they are not given the kind of press coverage that other crimes get. It's different when the crime is felt to be particularly heinous, let's say like child rape, and in the press reports of these outstanding crimes and criminals, their bizarre aspects will be focused. If proven guilty, the criminals are dealt with harshly as the law allows, but there is also a lot of focus on them, from the media. So many serial killers and, very heinous rapists, their stories have been unearthed, their childhood have been focused on. Netflix has different kinds of series on many serial killers like Ted Bundy. Many of you may have already watched it, and again you will see that some of these very heinous crimes like what happened in Burari, etc., they get captured into shows. So interestingly, what you see is a representation, and this representation is primarily sensational, but also rooted in many stereotypes, right. So, it is actually this ritual enactment as much as the actual sentence which is passed, which leads the media to treat such court cases as newsworthy, and therefore, there is a sensational element in the media. For the newspapers, this official response is very newsworthy, and it is as newsworthy as TV and electronic media, and the real events are basically seen as constituting the crime wave. What you see is shifts in the press coverage of mugging from events to court cases, and then the shift back to the events only, which basically is also not random. So, you have primarily judicial admonitions as a way in which the crime gets constructed ideologically, and these admonitions are meant for the public at large, and these are relayed to them through the media. So, the media actually also becomes a tool to take what happens in the courts and in the judiciary to the public, which is why in many cases trials are public and you can also watch them live, either online or offline, and the understanding behind it is that there should be messages relayed to the public. So, the media plays a role in many cases where there is very high level interest, there is minute by minute reporting, and there would be basically coverage of each and every aspect of an episode. The police are also amplifiers because the public concern is shaped by criminal statistics which the police produce and also interpret for the media, and the impression is that there is a wave after wave of new crimes. This is very interesting that we talk about crimes and we talk about how crimes are happening, how it is basically also reflection of what kind of society we live in, etc. What you observe is the process of social production of news. It is the end product of a complex process which begins with a systematic sorting and selection of events and topics according to a socially constructed set of categories. So, news is not news coincidentally, it is socially, economically, culturally produced, and this is where the professional ideology of what constitutes good news is basically structuring the process. You can see how the propaganda model as an analytical framework along with Hall's understanding of creation of news allows us to understand what we as consumers consume. This involves an orientation to items which are out of the ordinary. Ordinary is not news, which in some way breaches the normal expectations about social life, for instance, a sudden earthquake or the moon landing, and this might be called the primary or cardinal news value. What you have is a focus on the newsworthiness. Yet clearly extraordinariness does not exhaust the list. This is also important. Events which concern elite persons or nations, dramatic events which can be personalized to point up the essentially human characteristics of humor, sentimentality, etc., events which have negative consequences and which are part of an existing newsworthy theme are all possible news stories. What you have is disasters, dramas, everyday antics, funny and tragic of ordinary folk, the lives of the rich and the powerful, and perennial themes as football and cricket. They all find a regular place within the pages of a newspaper. Now, the journalist will tend to play up the extraordinary, dramatic, tragic, etc. elements in a story to enhance its newsworthiness, and events which score high on a number of these news values will have greater news potential. So, today when newspapers are bringing out digital editions, it is really interesting that they have a broader ambit to publish news digitally, but when they have to finally publish the physical copies, they will only choose the news items which they consider to be of higher value. So, it is also a very interesting way to understand the social production of news when you have digital editions versus the physical edition. So, many op-eds may be written in the digital sphere, but only some will find space in the physical newspaper. So, for events which score high on many of these dimensions that we have spoken about, like what happened with the Kennedy assassinations, basically very unexpected and dramatic with a negative consequence, as well as human tragedies that involve elite persons who were also heads of very powerful nations, they become very newsworthy, that programs itself get interrupted and you have a complete shift to what happens in these very extraordinary events, which are communicated to also us immediately. So, the extraordinariness also has layers, and these layers of the extraordinariness are dependent on mostly also the question of power and hierarchy and how it can operate. News values tend to operate together as a structure. This structure is very important. News values, they provide the criteria in the routine practices of journalism, which enable the journalists, editors and news people to decide routinely and regularly which stories are newsworthy. It is the structure which tells them the TRP ratings, who and how news is read and created. So, these may not be written down anywhere, formally transmitted or codified, but news values seem to be widely shared between the different kinds of news media, and everyone seems to know what is newsworthy. For Stuart Hall, the way a news story is constructed is also important, and through its construction, the news story seeks to make sense for an assumed audience. So, the audience is assumed, it is presupposed, it exists, and the news is supposed to make sense to them. This process of identification and contextualization is one of the most important ones through which events are made to mean by the media. What basically is happening is meaning is created by the media, where there is a focus on bringing to us through the production process certain representations and certain labels. Now, in this lecture we looked at two works by Stuart Hall, one that looks at how language and culture are very central to questions of representation, and how then that is used to create a kind of news through what he calls the moral panic in reportage of news on mugging in the UK, in the second work, precisely to talk about how identities are represented, how crimes are represented, and how the inner workings of the media are reflected. So, thank you very much.